Welcome to the debate. So what happens when a global superpower uses a remote, windswept island as basically as a bargaining chip for a war in the Middle East?
Yeah, it sounds like a political thriller, honestly.
It really does. But recently, rumors surfaced that Donald Trump might actually pull United States support for the UK's claim over the Falkland Islands, or, as they're known in Argentina, the Islas Malvinas.
Right. And the catch is, this is all reportedly unless the UK cooperates with US strategies regarding Iran.
Exactly. So suddenly, this 200-year-old territorial dispute with Argentina is just a modern geopolitical flashpoint all over again.
And I mean, that rumor alone was enough to trigger some very definitive, very high-stakes official statements from both Argentine and UK leadership. It just reminds us how quickly this dormant volcano can erupt,
Yeah, absolutely.
UK officials like Yvette Cooper and Stephen Doughty, they immediately fired back. They stated unequivocally that sovereignty rests with the UK and self-determination rests with the islanders.
Which in turn prompted the Argentine chancellor, Pablo Quirno, to forcefully reiterate Argentina's position. He argued that the islands are an illegally occupied territory and that the situation demands immediate bilateral negotiations.
Right. So it forces us to confront this fundamental friction in international law. When you're resolving an enduring territorial dispute like this, which principle actually takes precedence? So today, I'll be arguing from the perspective of historical sovereignty and territorial integrity, framing this as an unresolved colonial situation that absolutely requires bilateral negotiation. And I will be defending the principle of self-determination, as well as the administrative reality on the ground. Grounded in those recent firm responses from UK leadership, I'll argue that sovereignty rests firmly with the UK and that the right to determine the territory's future rests exclusively with the people who actually live there.
All right. Well, let's start with the immediate catalyst for this renewed tension, because I think it perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of the UK's position.
Okay, how so?
Well, if you're listening to this in London or Buenos Aires, you probably have a very entrenched view of who owns these islands. But let's step outside of that for a second and just look at the geopolitical mechanics. Why does a rumor about Washington's stance on Iran suddenly threaten British control in the South Atlantic?
Well, primarily because the United States provides immense logistical and, crucially, diplomatic cover for the UK globally. I mean, the UK's administrative hold on the islands is rock solid locally. But diplomatically, it relies heavily on its allies to block or veto aggressive moves in international forums, like the United Nations.
Exactly. So if Washington uses the Malvinas as leverage, essentially saying to London, we won't back your territorial claims at the UN unless you back our sanctions or our military posturing on Iran, suddenly the UK's position is completely isolated.
Yeah, they're exposed.
Right. That is the mechanism of modern geopolitics. The UK's control relies on this alliance network that can be turned on or off based on totally unrelated global conflicts. And this exposes the structural, legal issue that Argentina, as articulated by Chancellor Quirno, has been pointing out for decades.
Which is?
That the UK's presence on the islands is built on a very fragile, legally dubious foundation that dates all the way back to 1833.
Wait, hold on. We are talking about modern superpower leverage, right? And you want to rewind to 1833. You're going back almost 2 centuries to define the present reality of the people living there right now.
Yes, because you cannot understand the current legal dispute without understanding how that current population got there in the first place.
Okay, but
in 1833, the United Kingdom occupied the islands through a direct act of force. They expelled the Argentine authorities and the population that was there. This was not the peaceful settlement of what international law calls terra nullius, meaning nobody's land.
Right.
It was an illegal act, contrary to the international law of the time, and it fundamentally violated Argentina's territorial integrity. That original sin initiated a colonial situation that persists right now, today. And it is formally recognized as such by the United Nations General Assembly. Resolution 265 explicitly calls for Argentina and the UK to resolve the sovereignty dispute via bilateral negotiations.
I mean, I understand the historical grievance. I really do. But applying 19th century grievances to 21st century populations creates this massive ethical and legal blind spot.
How is it a blind spot to follow international law?
Because following these rumors about the U.S. leveraging its support, Yvette Cooper was forced to be incredibly clear. Her statement is the bedrock of this perspective. The Falklands Islands are British, sovereignty rests with the UK, self-determination rests with the islanders. That isn't just, diplomatic stubbornness.
Well, it certainly looks like it from Buenos Aires.
But it is the practical reality of modern international relations. You have a community that has existed there for generations.
Let me stop you there, because you just used the word self-determination, and we need to be extremely precise about what that means under international law.
Fair enough.
Crucially, the current inhabitants of the islands are what international law considers an implanted population. Because they were put there by the occupying power after an illegal expulsion, they do not hold the right to self-determination in the way, say, a colonized indigenous people would.
The concept of an implanted population is a highly theoretical framework that just completely ignores lived reality.
No, it's a legal framework designed specifically to prevent the legitimization of illegal land grabs. I mean, think about it like real estate.
Okay.
If someone illegally occupies your house by force, moves their family in, and then just waits a few decades, you wouldn't let them hold a democratic household vote to decide who gets the deed.
Wow.
That is essentially Argentina's view of how the UK justifies its presence. It is logically equivalent to letting trespassers hold a binding vote on who owns the property they're currently occupying. It completely circumvences the concept of territorial integrity.
Wait, hold on. You're comparing 8 generations of families to trespassers squatting in a house? That analogy completely collapses when you factor in actual human rights.
I'm illustrating the legal mechanism.
But we are talking about living, breathing societies, not administrative errors to be corrected on some colonial ledger. I mean, how many generations must pass before a population ceases to be implanted and earns the basic human right of having a say in their own government?
Well, the law doesn't have an expiration date on illegal occupation.
If you look at the timeline from 1833 to today, we are talking about families who have built a distinct culture, an economy, a whole way of life over nearly 200 years.
But the passage of time doesn't retroactively legitimize an illegal occupation under international law. If it did, any powerful nation could simply conquer territory, move its citizens in, and just wait out the clock.
But at what point does the international legal theory of territorial integrity start to actively violate the UN Charter itself? Because the Charter places the principle of self-determination at the very center of international law.
For recognized peoples, yes?
Well, you mentioned democratic votes earlier. We have to talk about the 2013 referendum. The islanders voted on their political status, and 99.8% voted to remain a UK territory.
Right.
To the UK and to the islanders themselves, that is the ultimate mic drop of self-determination. To say to a community, your great-great-great-grandparents arrived under circumstances we deem illegal, therefore your 99.8% democratic consensus is legally meaningless, I mean, that is incredibly draconian.
It's not draconian, it's just legally consistent. As I said, the UN has never recognized the current inhabitants of the Malvinas as a distinct people entitled to self-determination.
According to a very specific reading of UN resolutions,
the 2013 referendum isn't democracy, it's a demographic loophole. I mean, a colonial power asking its own implanted citizens if they want to remain citizens of the colonial power, it's a foregone conclusion. It carries zero weight in resolving the actual sovereignty dispute between London and Buenos Aires.
They would argue it carries all the weight.
And look, Argentina is not ignoring the human element here. The Argentine Constitution explicitly guarantees respect for the way of life of the islanders in any settlement.
Right, but
respecting their way of life is fundamentally different from granting them sovereignty over a contested territory.
See, promising to respect their way of life from a capital thousands of miles away, while simultaneously stripping them of their right to self-governance, that rings very hollow to the people actually on the ground.
I'm sure it does, but
Yvette Cooper's stance correctly identifies that the inhabitants cannot simply be treated as pawns to be traded between Buenos Aires and London. The islands are not a chessboard.
They might not be a chessboard, but they are a major geopolitical issue. And Argentina isn't just screaming into the void here. If we are talking about international law, We have to look at how the global community actually weighs these competing claims.
Mm-hmm.
When Chancellor Quirino demands bilateral negotiations, he is backed by overwhelming multilateral support. This isn't just some isolated Argentine grievance.
Right. You're referring to the various diplomatic blocs in the global south?
I'm referring to a massive international consensus. Argentina has the explicit backing of the global south. We're talking organizations representing dozens of developing nations. This includes Latin American coalitions, the Group of 77, and crucially, the UN's Special Committee on Decolonization.
Sure.
The listener needs to understand why this matters. These nations often share a deep history of colonization. So when they look at the UK holding on to an archipelago off the coast of South America, thousands of miles from London, they don't view it through a lens of British administrative efficiency.
No, they view it politically.
They view it through a lens of anti-imperialism. The international community recognizes this as a special and particular colonial situation, and they fundamentally reject the UK's unilateral refusal to negotiate.
Okay, but let's be very clear about the actual weight of that consensus. I acknowledge that broad international call for dialogue. It is a reality of the diplomatic landscape, particularly within Latin American forums where, frankly, solidarity with Argentina is basically a diplomatic requirement.
It's more than just a requirement, it's a shared legal stance.
But we have to distinguish between multilateral diplomatic pressure and real hard administrative reality. Declarations from developing nation coalitions, or even, frankly, the rumors of the United States leveraging its UN veto to force UK cooperation on Iran, none of that overrides the material reality on the ground.
They absolutely delegitimize it, though. When the UN repeatedly tells a nation to negotiate and that nation just outright refuses, it weakens the entire rules-based international order.
They express a political preference. But let's look at the mechanics of realpolitik for a second. Stephen Doughty reiterated to Parliament that the UK's commitment is unwavering. Why? Because continuous British administration is a fact.
Supported by military force.
The UK provides the defense, manages the currency, and supports the local government. Bilateral negotiations over sovereignty are essentially a non-starter when the sovereign power and the inhabitants universally oppose a change in status.
Right.
The international community can pass as many non-binding resolutions as it likes, urging dialogue. But in the realm of international law, you cannot force a sovereign state to negotiate away its territory. You just can't.
Well, that argument basically boils down to might makes right. You're saying the UK has administrative control simply because it has the military and economic power to maintain it and the diplomatic muscle to ignore the UN.
I'm saying they have the mandate of the people living there.
But that brings us to where this theoretical debate over UN resolutions in 19th century history violently collides with the present day. Because this isn't just about flags and maps.
No, it's about the economy too.
Exactly. There are billions of dollars at stake right now. That unwavering commitment from the UK isn't just about protecting a population's way of life. It's about protecting immense economic interests.
You're talking about the offshore oil exploration.
I'm talking about the unilateral exploitation of resources. Chancellor Quirino didn't just issue a historical complaint. He strongly denounced immediate economic actions currently underway. Specifically, the final investment decision announced by companies like Rockhopper Exploration and Navitas Petroleum for the Sea Lion oil field.
Right.
From the perspective of territorial integrity, these are entirely illegal activities.
Illegal according to Argentina, but entirely lawful under the local Falkland Islands government, which actually issues the licenses.
Illegal under UN resolutions. Resolutions that explicitly call on both parties to refrain from taking unilateral actions that would alter the situation while the sovereignty dispute is pending.
Well, the
mechanism here is insidious. By granting these licenses for hydrocarbon extraction, the UK is actively taking wealth from a contested area before the contest is legally resolved. It's a blatant violation of Argentina's sovereign rights over the resources in its maritime spaces.
If you assume those are Argentina's spaces.
What the UK is doing is attempting to create facts under the water. I mean, if you build massive multi-billion-dollar oil infrastructure, you embed multinational corporate interests into the colonial situation. It makes it infinitely harder to untangle. It's an attempt to make the occupation permanent and profitable.
That assumes the waters definitively belong to Argentina, which, as we've established, the UK categorically rejects. But let's look at the actual mechanism of economic development from the perspective of self-determination.
Okay.
If one accepts the premise that the islanders have a right to determine their own future, then economic development is a fundamental human right of that territory. How can a population be truly self-determining if they are barred from developing the resources in their own exclusive economic zone?
Even while the international community formally recognizes a pending sovereignty dispute, you think they should just drill anyway?
Yes, because life has to continue. A society cannot be put into suspended animation for decades waiting for a diplomatic resolution that may never come.
But it complicates the resolution.
The islands have to function. They have to fund their schools, their healthcare, their infrastructure. Granting licenses to companies like Rockhopper and Navitas is a legitimate and necessary exercise of modern administration. They shouldn't be forced into economic stagnation just because a neighboring country claims their land based on a 19th century grievance.
It's a bit more than a grievance.
For the UK, ensuring the islanders can be economically self-sufficient is the core of that unwavering commitment Stephen Dowdy spoke about.
But economic self-sufficiency built on contested, legally ambiguous resource extraction is inherently unstable. And this ties back perfectly to exactly why we are having this conversation today. The rumors about the US, Trump, and Iran.
How so?
Oil companies like Navitas rely on geopolitical stability to secure funding. Banks do not want to finance a multi-billion-dollar offshore drill if the sovereignty of the water might flip tomorrow.
That's true. Markets hate uncertainty.
Right. And right now, that drilling relies entirely on the UK's military umbrella and the tacit diplomatic approval of allies like the United States.
Which is exactly why the UK leadership had to speak up so quickly and so firmly.
Precisely. If the U.S. were to pivot, if Washington actually uses the Malvinas as leverage for Iran and pulls its diplomatic cover, the risk profile for those oil companies skyrockets. Without U.S. backing, the UN might pass stronger binding resolutions against the drilling. The geopolitical cover for these unilateral economic actions would evaporate overnight.
Yeah, it's a huge vulnerability.
It proves that the UK's so-called administrative reality is actually incredibly fragile. It is completely exposed to the shifting winds of superpower politics.
See, I read that reaction differently. Yvette Cooper's immediate and definitive response wasn't a sign of fragility, it was a demonstration of resolve.
Resolving to ignore international pressure?
By stating clearly that the UK's commitment is unwavering, regardless of who is in the White House or what is happening with Iran, the UK is signaling to those financial markets and to Argentina that its sovereignty is not up for debate, and its defense of the islanders' right to develop the sea line field is not contingent on Washington's moods. The administration of the territory operates independently of those broader superpower maneuvers.
Well, it attempts to project independence, but as we've seen, the diplomatic friction is completely unavoidable. When the U.S. sneezes in the Middle East, the U.K. catches a cold in the South Atlantic.
That's a fair point.
And that really highlights the profound gap between the two legal philosophies we've unpacked today. From the perspective of territorial integrity, you simply cannot build a legitimate, stable present on a fractured, illegal foundation.
Right.
The core of the issue remains an unresolved violation originating in 1833. True resolution of this dispute requires respecting the architecture of international law, specifically the multilateral consensus that demands bilateral negotiations. You cannot bypass international law by relying on unilateral resource extraction or by using a population implanted by force as this sort of artificial democratic shield to legitimize a land grab.
But treating living, breathing human beings as an implanted population to be managed by international courts just ignores the deep reality of their existence.
It's legal terminology, but I hear you.
Summarizing the opposing perspective, self-determination is not a loophole. It is the bedrock of modern democratic rights. You cannot erase a multi-generational history. Maintaining that self-determination applies to these islanders and supporting the UK's unwavering commitment to their security and economic prosperity is viewed by many as the most practically and legally sound basis for the territory's status.
Even despite the UN stance?
Yes, because the reality of a thriving, self-sufficient community backed by a 99.8% Democratic mandate simply supersedes a 200-year-old historical claim.
Well, what becomes strikingly clear is that this is never just a debate about history. It actively intersects with modern global resource economics. I mean, the billions of dollars under that sea lion field, and shifting superpower alliances. The fact that a rumor about Iran policy could threaten the stability of an archipelago in the South Atlantic, it just demonstrates how interconnected and volatile international law really is.
Absolutely. It's like a perfect storm of 19th century history, 21st century resource economics, and just the blunt reality of modern diplomacy. Understanding both the legal frameworks of decolonization and the contemporary arguments of self-determination is really essential here.
Definitely.
The diplomatic history of this region is incredibly dense, and there is so much more to explore when you start pulling at the threads of how international alliances actually function in practice.
Which brings us back to that fundamental friction we started with. The lines on our global map are not immutable facts, you know? They're the active tension between history's long memory and the lived reality of the present. And as the geopolitical winds continue to shift, whether in Washington, London, or Buenos Aires, we are left wondering, can international law ever truly reconcile a broken past with a